Good evening, everyone. My name is Yaron, and I'm the director of the Jewish Studies program here at the College of Charleston. At the Yaschik Arnold Jewish Studies program, we offer a wide range of events that all used to be in person once upon a time, and now we offer them here to you via this very common medium of Zoom, and we have a lot of them coming up. You can access a full list of our events on our website. It's jewish.cfc.edu/events, and we can type that in the chat in a minute. And on that page, you will see links to all of our upcoming events and how you can get the Zoom link to join. There are links for all of them. We have a very fascinating conversation with Manish Tana, who is an African-American Orthodox rabbi. This is coming up next week on the 13th at 7 p.m. We have a wonderful event related to a movie, Body and Soul, and I'm sure Dr. Walters, who's with us tonight, can say a lot more about this event than I can. And many more fascinating things coming up this semester between now and December, and I encourage you all to check our list and see what we have. And many more exciting things coming up in the spring. That's not on the website yet, so you're just gonna have to trust me on that. We are very fortunate to have this event tonight, sponsored by our program, by the Pearlstein Lipov Center for Southern Jewish Culture, by and really this is a great event. Actually, this is not sponsored by the Pearlstein Lipov Center. I guess I'm confused. We have so many events going on that sometimes I don't remember who sponsors what. But anyways, I guess my point is that we are all very thankful for the very extensive network that we have going on here in Charleston and beyond Charleston that supports our program and has supported our program over the years. And we're thankful for all of you who attend our events. If this is your first time here, we hope you come back. That's it. I'm not going to take any more of your time. We are ready to begin. And we have with us Dr. Ashley Walters, who is in her first year teaching at our program. She came to us from Stanford, where she completed her PhD. And she is an assistant professor of Jewish studies. And this is maybe why I got confused, the soon-to-be director of the Pearlstein Lipov Center for Southern Jewish Culture. And so I'll hand it over to Ashley, and she can introduce our speaker for tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Yaron, for that introduction. I will introduce our guest of honor, Professor Marc Dollinger, in just a minute. But first, what I'd like to do is explain how tonight's gathering is going to work. So the plan is for Dr. Dollinger to introduce his work for about 15 minutes. Then I'd like to start us off with a couple of questions. I have so many questions from this book, but I'll limit myself to just a couple. After that, we will take questions from the audience. And we kindly ask that you type questions into the chat box, which Kim, Yaron, and I are monitoring throughout the talk. As we work our way through the questions, I will invite you to take yourself off mute and ask them. In the case that you're unable to speak up, I'm more than happy to read the question on your behalf. Also, if any issues arise, if you're experiencing technological glitches, please feel free to let us know through the chat function, and we will do the best we can to help. Our goal is to get as many questions covered as we can in 1 hour. At 8 p.m. we will end the formal session, but keep the Zoom room open for a little while longer for anyone that would like to linger and perhaps speak more informally with Professor Dollinger. And I should say we will be recording this session, and it will be available on YouTube in the next couple of days. So to help us avoid any unintended audio, please make sure that your microphone is on mute. So now I'd like to share a bit about the author of this truly wonderful and groundbreaking book we will be discussing this evening. Dr. Marc Dollinger holds the Richard and Rhoda Goldman Endowed Chair in Jewish Studies and Social Responsibility at San Francisco State University. He has served as a research fellow at Princeton University's Center for the Study of Religion. He has also been an Andrew W. Mellon postdoctoral fellow and lecturer in the humanities at Bryn Mawr College, where he coordinated the program in Jewish Studies. Professor Dollinger is the author of 4 scholarly books in American Jewish history, most recently, Black Power, Jewish Politics, Reinventing the Alliance in the 1960s, which will be the focus of tonight's conversation. His next project traces his own experience fighting campus anti-Semitism at both right-wing and left-wing universities, and I do hope that he will be able to share a little bit about this project with us tonight. So please welcome me please join me in welcoming Dr. Dollinger. I'm so happy to have you with us, and I thank you for bringing this truly wonderful book into the world. As someone who teaches on the topic of Blacks, Jews, and Jews of color in the United States, I was absolutely thrilled when this book came out, precisely because it takes on so many narratives that have become central to post-war American Jewish identity in a very nuanced way. So with that, I'd like to turn the floor over to you so that you can share with us a bit about your book and how it came into being.
Thanks so much. I'm going to share my screen here for a moment. And as I get it all set up, thank you, Kim, Ashley, Yaron, for all of the work. It's great to be here. And just a brief look at the folks. Steve Whitfield is here, my colleague and my wife's favorite professor from her time at Brandeis. And Michael Coburn's here. I think that if this is the same one who was my student at SF State, great to see you here as well. Okay, so here's the easy part. What is history? We'll call it the study of the past. For my colleagues here, and certainly for those who are interested in a polysyllabic, the word is historiography. And the key here is that word graph inside. Historiography is the writing of historical writing. It's the study of how academic historians have studied the past. So we are less interested in scholars in history as we are in historiography, in looking at the ways previous generations have tended to understand a question. So what looks to you like the 25th letter of the alphabet, and I have a pointer here, which I hope you'll be able to see, I will call a visual representation of the early literature on this topic of the relations between white Jews and Blacks. And here in the upper left-hand corner, let's say that this is Black Americans, and over here on the right, this will be white Jews. And you'll notice they're apart from one another. But over time, look what happens here in the middle. They come together. This would be the Civil Rights Alliance of the 1950s and 60s. And yes, like that famous picture of King and Heschel, they're marching together through history. Well, this historiographic approach works only if you stop the history in the mid-1960s. Because as most of us are probably aware, the Black-Jewish Alliance split with the rise of Black Power, leading now to a new historiographic letter. We'll use the letter X. And here we have to revise our historical memory, the way in which we think that history happened, to put Blacks here, white Jews over here. And look, they came together in the middle of the X. But now in the new literature, this middle of the X is 1954-ish with the Montgomery bus boycott or the Brown decision. And it lasts really only about a decade till about 1964 with the rise of Black Power or the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act the next year. And if we continue through history down here to the bottom, and I was going to say this is where we are today, but I think we have some optimism with what's happening literally today, that Blacks and white Jews are once again separate and apart. So my book is as much about historical memory as it is even about history and historiography. And in order to illustrate this, I'm going to give you a textual challenge. And since there's too many and we're sadly, not able to be in person, if you're watching with someone else on the screen, you can give yourself a little test. So I'm giving you a quotation here, but I've done two things to the quote. I've removed the author and the year. And your challenge as you're watching, and you know what, put it in the chat box if you want to try and answer. I'll put the chat box here so I can see it as well. The question would be, who said this and when? And for the visual learners and auditory ones, I'll read it to you. Black power stresses Black initiative, Black self-worth, Black identity, Black pride. Black power seeks the growth and development of Black economic and political power. Black power seeks Black leadership development. Who would have said this and when? And if you don't know the exact name of a person, the kind of a person, and make the best guess. If anyone has any ideas, just type it in the Zoom. And as you're thinking, I'll tell you that, of course, when I read this for the first time in the archives, I imagine this was probably Stokely Carmichael, the leader of the Black Power movement, or maybe Malcolm X, or another sort of Black militant who was promoting Black power. And imagine my surprise to discover it was the American Jewish Committee in 1969. The American Jewish Committee, a national center, if not center, right-leaning Jewish organization, 1969, really in the midst of really bad relations between Blacks and Jews. So I understood that if the AJC is saying this in 1969, we're going to need to look again at the bottom of that X. And maybe the two communities were not as far apart as we thought. Text 2. All right, this is not actually text, it's just a straight up question. How would the Anti-Defamation League respond to the rise of the Nation of Islam? Well, the Anti-Defamation League is all about fighting anti-Semitism. The Nation of Islam, which is Louis Farrakhan now, Malcolm X before that, Elijah Muhammad before that, they're one of the most anti-Semitic groups around. So the answer, of course, is that they would reject the Nation of Islam and they would criticize them. Well, in 1959, Time magazine did a cover story on Elijah Muhammad and the nation, and it was a hit piece, and it said a lot of really bad things about Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam. And I'm in the archives, this one in the American Jewish Historical Society in New York City, and I come across a confidential memo that has a stamp on it, not for publication. Fortunately, that stamp did not apply to me. And here, Arnold Forster of the ADL writes to every one of his regional offices the following: Time magazine notwithstanding, we have no documentable evidence of anti-Semitism on the part of the Temples of Islam movement or Elijah Muhammad. That's just not true. There was documentable evidence. But the head of the ADL is telling his regional offices that they don't, and he's doing it secretly in a confidential memo. And this means, of course, that even the history of the 1950s has to be redone. All right, in this quote, the longstanding Black distrust of white people, by the way, I put that in blocks and quotes because I did this talk at the Hartman Institute in New York, and they're very smart there, and they know that what word used to describe African Americans can tell you the era where the quote came from. So every time I give this test, I take out whatever word they use and I just put in black so that none of you can have any confidence that the use of vocabulary will give you the answer. So we'll just say the longstanding Black distrust of white people, born of oppression, is manifesting itself in a growing spirit of go it alone. According to this person, Blacks were already reevaluating their alliances. They'd come to know their strength, politically and economically. And the person who wrote this predicted, quote, a period of mutual irritation and misunderstanding, followed by a spike in new and more active forms of Black anti-Semitism. We've only been together a few minutes, but you're probably guessing that the answer to this question is not what you'd imagine. It was the ADL. And even more significant than the Anti-Defamation League saying these words was the year 1960. Because most of the historiography, most of the historical memory tells us that everything was great with Blacks and Jews and Heschel and King through the mid-60s, and at least 1963, August with the March on Washington speech, right? Until Black power, Black anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, all the terrible stuff emerges and ruins a good thing. And now we find by looking, and this was actually publicized, this was not a secret memo, that in 1960, ADL leadership is already saying there is a longstanding, and they used the word Negro, distrust of white people, that it was born of oppression. There's a go it alone spirit. I'll call that predicting the rise of Black power, that Blacks were reevaluating their alliances. And guess what? There's going to be anti-Semitism from the Black community. Therefore, the rise of all of these trends in the mid-1960s should be no surprise. I'm tired of the philanthropy of rich white men towards your race. I want to see you fight your own battles with your own leaders and your own money. We white men of whatever creed or faith cannot fight your battles for you. We will stand shoulder to shoulder with you until you can fight as generals all by yourselves. All right, it says we white men, so yes, it's a white man who said this. And okay, I'll say it, it's a white Jewish man because you're here in the Jewish studies at the College of Charleston. But the question is, which white man said this and when? That this person is tired of the philanthropy of rich white men. And there's going to be a time when you have to fight your battles with your own leader and your own money. Joel Spingarn, 1914. Joel Spingarn, with his brother Arthur and W.B. Du Bois, the first African-American to earn the PhD from Harvard, were the founders of the NAACP. This was not a marginal white Jewish liberal progressive social justice guy. This was one of the most important activists of his generation. And I'll share with you, in 1914, in front of a Black audience, he says to them, I'm tired of the philanthropy of rich white men towards your race. It's self-critique, right? I want to see you fight your own battles with your own leaders and your own money. We'll stand shoulder to shoulder until you can fight as generals. I argue fighting as generals all by yourselves became Black power. Spingarn predicted Black power 50 years before it happened. And this undermines the historiography and our historical memory. And now we have to think in new ways about what was really going on in this period. Well, this book project actually didn't start as a Black power book. Its first title was Turning Inward, because I was interested in the American Jewish turn on Soviet Jewry and American Zionism and religious expression and even right-wing politics and neoconservatives and the JDL. And then I found this quote. Perhaps the saddest element in this whole frightening picture is in the fact that Jews are the people who are best able to understand the rhetoric of Black power, even though they're most directly on the firing line of its attack. So here is a person who understands there's a frightening picture between these two communities, understands that anti-Semitism is coming at Jews, that Jews are directly on the firing line, but Jews should be able to understand it better. And here he is, Rabbi Arthur Hertzberg, and he said it in '66, which is a pretty intense time as well. Columbia University professor, congregational rabbi, conservative movement, wrote The Zionist Idea, one of the important books on Zionist ideology. And he understood in the middle of it that there was actually similarities between Blacks and Jews. And with his quote, I began to rethink a new letter to understand relations between Blacks and Jews. And since we had X and Y, I had to go with the Z. Let's have Blacks and Jews up here together in the civil rights movement. Look, they're marching across the top of the Z. Oh, it's great. But wait, no, Black power sends us backwards and separates us to the bottom of the Z. And what happened after was a parallel movement where Blacks and white Jews were not proximate to one another, but they were following the same ethnic identity, ethnic politics path. And with that, I will hand it back over to you and stop my screen sharing so we can go to conversation.
All right, thank you. So I wanted to invite you to talk a bit about, you introduced this concept of historical memory to us, but I wanted to invite you to talk a little bit about you know, the existing narrative for those who might not be familiar with Jews during, American Jews during civil rights movement, where this narrative came from, when exactly this narrative coalesced around this Black Jewish alliance. Was it when it was unfolding and actually in real time, or did it emerge later as Jews start to kind of experience this ethnic revival and start to cultivate a narrative about their place in the United States? And then invite you to reflect on this historical memory and what exactly that means for American Jews going forward.
Okay, thank you. Great questions. And so now we're gonna get complicated. We often talk about the invention of history or the invention of narratives as if we're making it up. We're not actually making it up. I mean, it is actually true that white Jews were very involved in civil rights, in fact, disproportionately involved. There were cases where a majority of the white civil rights workers in any given room would have been Jews. So there is something about Jewishness which is exceptional in that case. And of course, this then dominated the historiography, and so much of the early literature told that story and then ended it there. And what's happened in subsequent generations is we're now sort of lifting the camera broader, we're looking in different kinds of perspectives, and we're understanding there's more to the story. So the first thing I want to say is, I'm not rejecting outright the truthfulness of the earlier narratives. I'm just saying that the way history works, it comes in lots of angles. So now just a trigger warning for everybody present who has embraced the early version. And this is how I came to want to look in new directions. So when I was growing up, this was what I had heard. There were three reasons why white Jews would join with blacks in civil rights. One was a history argument. Blacks and Jews suffered common histories of oppression. And for that reason, it made perfect sense that Jews, more than other white Americans, would be helping out. Related was a sociology argument. Blacks and Jews both experience what it is to be on the outside of society and therefore are in solidarity with one another. And then the third one is the religion or Judaism argument. Social justice, prophetic Judaism is central to faith for Jews. Therefore, regardless of history or sociology, Jews are supposed to do this stuff. Except the African American experience and the Jewish American historical experience have been fundamentally different. For Black Americans, it's been about slavery and its legacy. For Jewish Americans, it's been, for the most part, a rapid ascension up the social mobility ladder. So to argue, at least on the domestic scene, that a common history brought the two groups together, it just didn't. Related sociologically speaking, and Eric Goldstein at Emory is the one who did the early research on this, if it was true that a marginal status would bring the groups together, the civil rights movement should have occurred in the 1920s. Or 1930s, when we had domestic anti-Semitism at much higher levels than we did in the 50s and 60s, which is when the movement actually coalesced. And if Judaism says get involved, the Orthodox should be the most involved. But they've been the least involved because they actually don't see this as part of halakha, of Jewish law. And the most engaged Jews have been the Reform movement, which is least ritually observant. But to be honest, and since I enjoy tenure, I'll say it, most of the Jews involved were actually not going with Jewish organizations, and they were leftists and socialists, and some of them were even communists. So that even gets turned upside down. So I would say that the narrative holds because, first of all, it is true for the reasons I described at the beginning, and it also is a really nice self-complementary understanding of Jewish engagement and involvement. It hurts us, though, if that's where we end the look, because it doesn't explain what happened in the mid-60s with the breakup. I mean, if those reasons were true, we would not have had a breakup, and then everything after that. And then you said, talk about today, so I have to give you my joke answer and then my serious answer. My joke answer is, I'm an historian. It's tough enough to predict the past. Talking about today or tomorrow, I'll leave to the social scientists. But on a serious note, and we were talking about this just before we came live, this kind of historical research is quite resonant now in contemporary society. And I think what we see now is a whole lot of American Jews critically examining their own sense of memory around their role as Jews and Jews' historical role around race and racism, and becoming humble in a really good way to understand that they need to construct new narratives for understanding their past. So I'll pause it there.
Wonderful. So I wanted to kind of build off of something you just said, and that being about how this is a story of leadership and institutions. When I was reading your book, I was struck at how many individuals I recognized from various leadership positions in the Jewish community. And so it made me wonder, you had indicated that Jewish leadership tended to get it. They tended to understand what was happening with Black power and the kind of rise of identity politics during this time, and they were sympathetic to it for the most part. But it made me wonder about the average Jew, however you would kind of describe that. It's a terrible way to phrase it, but it makes me wonder about whether or not Jews were able to recognize the limits of liberalism from their home, the ways in which these leaders did.
That is such a good question in so many ways. If we have graduate students here, I'll just offer this as a little advice as you're thinking about your dissertations to control your source material. I'll engage first in self-critique, which is that this book is about Jewish communal organizations and specifically their leaders. That makes it almost all white, almost all male, and almost all about Jews proclaiming to be Jews. And it ignores, in that sense, the average Jew, right, as we would have it. Now, I did my best to put in as much sort of data that I can to sort of fill around it. But the reason I chose that group was I really wanted to know how Jewish leaders who identify themselves as Jewish leaders looked at politics and looked at race through the specific lens of Jews. So the first thing I have to say is I'm not speaking or writing on behalf of all Jews. So the first piece was how surprised I was that this group of all groups got it. Older white men understanding the limits of white Jewish liberalism, understanding the rise of Black militancy, and seeing within the American Jewish historical experience the need to recognize what privilege brought to Jews, especially in the 50s and 60s. Jews have not always had privilege in US history, to be sure. And then it became kind of an inverted thesis where the group that we didn't expect in history to get it, got it, right? And now when we look at, let's just take the white suburban Northern Jew watching the civil rights movement on the TV screen. Much of the narrative is about this group internalizing the sense that they were like Schwerner and Goodman, who along with Cheney were tragically killed. And that by offering verbal or financial support for civil rights was as if they were like one of these young Jews that actually went to the South. And by the way, politically and voting, they did. American Jews are the second most liberal or progressive voting bloc after Black Americans. 80 to 85%, would be on the high side in any given presidential election year. But for the most part, they were not critically examining the way in which their own suburban neighborhoods were racially segregated, though done without Jim Crow. So as I am moving between Jewish organizational leaders and sort of larger data sets that I was able to find, I noticed an invention of an historical past that tended to congratulate Jews for being so engaged in civil rights while ignoring the complicity that was occurring. And this wasn't on purpose complicity. This is like, if you buy a house in the suburbs and the suburbs are all white, guess what? You're part of an all white society. And everything that happens from that day on is going to reflect that. And that was an inevitable consequence of Jewish economic mobility.
Mm-hmm. So I want to pause there and just encourage you, if you have questions for Professor Dollinger, to please put them in the chat so we can start building up a group of questions to ask him. In the meantime, I do have one final question. Since we're in Charleston in the South, one of the things I wanted to know was to what degree is this potentially a regional story? We have stories about civil rights and civil rights workers coming south, and many Southern Jews feeling kind of beleaguered by these Northern Jews coming south with these different politics. And we know that some Southern Jews participated in civil rights. There were a number of prominent rabbis who spoke out, and there was a lot of sympathy. But I'm curious if the story of civil rights is different for the South, then is it possible that the story of ethnic revival among Jews in the South is also quite different?
Yeah, great. So let me take the first part, and then we'll get to the ethnic revival. And this actually comes to research for my first book, which was my dissertation. And it's great to be in Charleston to tell this story. I hope it will resonate stronger with you. And that is, when I submitted the first draft of my civil rights chapter to my doctoral committee, every member of the committee rejected it for the same reason. And that's a sad day for a graduate student, right? I appreciate that reaction, Dr. Walters. That was like exactly where I was in the moment. But the good news was that what they told me was that, I'd come up with an insight that I didn't even realize I had, which was that I did what all historians do with civil rights in region. I told the story of the North, and then I told the story of the South as exceptional to the North. I centered the Northern story. And I was patting myself on the back that I gave the Southern United States the same number of words as the North. That was going to be my historiographic contribution. What my doctoral committee shared with me, though, was that what I had done is I had set up a model where actually Southern Jews created Black-Jewish relations, and Northerners followed the Southern model a decade later. And this is something that had not yet been discussed in the literature. And that so much of the Jim Crow legal part versus the extra legal ways in the North that racism played out was something that most historians had sort of stopped at that line. And so I pushed it further. So yes, I'm seeing regionalism, but in this case, I'm actually placing the South in the center and saying that Northern Jews were facing the same questions Southern Jews faced and responded in a Northern specific way. In terms of ethnic identity, most of the work on Black power is really going to be more urban centered and more Northern, just because that's where most of the folks were. But that said, I think that the revival around ethnicity, and certainly I know you're going to work, in the Southern Jewish Center there, and Jewish summer camps in the South, has following the lead. And then, of course, as I'm sure most of all of you know, the differences between the urban areas in the South, which have a whole lot of Northern transplants, versus sort of smaller towns and older communities, those that are coming from the Eastern European migration, and those older communities from Central European also are playing a role too.
Absolutely, wonderful. Okay, we have our first question. Is there Craig Browdy? I invite you, if you'd like to take yourself off mute and ask the question directly, you're more than welcome to. Otherwise, I'm happy to read the questions for you. Craig Browdy?
I feel like can you hear me?
Uh-huh.
I feel like I'm typing with two thumbs. I can't get this right. My question is, what can we learn from the way that Jewish leaders who quote unquote got it in the 60s reacted to the rise of Black nationalism to better inform the way that we react to what's going on with the Black Lives Matter movement today?
Thank you, Craig. Great question. And I'm anticipating Philip's question, which is coming next. I'll just say, on all of the various talks I'm giving, no matter what the subject is, no matter if it has to do with today or Black Lives Matter, that's always the first question. So thank you for that. So what's happened since the murder of George Floyd in this racial reckoning nationally, and I'm of course more interested, in the American Jewish side of it, is folks looking back over the history and imagining there's more to the story than they have learned so far, and they want to learn it. So what we can learn from these Jewish leaders is that in the middle of a consensus-based peace, love, Bobby Sherman, kumbaya, arm in arm moment, that there was also existent there systemic difference. And that Jewish social justice leaders, whether they're on the ground in the South, the young secular Jews, or whether they were these organizational leaders, were being honest and real and genuine in recognizing what the limits are, and then how you can leverage the limits in order to get more good done. That the problem is when we in the current period invent a mythical past that even the people living in that path didn't believe, right? That's really what I'm saying. So let's all get rid of the mythology and deal and confront the reality. So in that sense, I'm drawing a very strong parallel between what Jewish activists in the 50s and early 60s were seeing and feeling and understanding against what nationally American Jews are learning now. Was there a Black Power component to that one as well, to the rise of nationalism? Maybe I can get that with Philip's question next, because I think we're going to go there.
Okay, Philip, would you like to ask your question?
You can read it out.
Okay. What explains the Black blindness to the evils of anti-Semitism?
Okay, so a couple things. First, we have to be careful. I know it's tough in chat when we're coming up with questions with the sort of group-based understandings of anything. We haven't yet talked about Jews of color, which I want to talk about as well. That was the epilogue of the book, and in fact, that was a profound challenge to everything I wrote, and was an invitation to come up with yet a new historiographic approach. So first I'll say that anytime there's anti-Semitism, you have to fight it. Anytime there's racism, sexism, all of the isms, and especially, of course, as Jews, we're going to be concerned with anti-Semitism. That also said, every community, however we want to define those communities, are going to have a variety of perspectives, and every community is going to have folks in them who are going to be on the margins, and certainly that the mainstream of that group is not going to be happy about. And that's definitely true, in the Black community. In my research, I talk a lot about the Black leftists in the mid-60s and how anti-Israel and anti-Zionist sentiment increases a lot, and how that sometimes came out as blatant anti-Semitism. With that, though, I want to give you a scholarly perspective and use this notion of constructed narrative that we've been talking about, or invented narrative. And I would like to say that there are actually multiple constructed narratives colliding at the same time around this question. So in the Black community now, there is for the first time a sense that white Americans understand the narrative of what it is to be Black or brown in America. A constructed narrative of Black history, of slavery, of institutional racism, right? All of that, let's just call that sort of one historical piece. There's a second historical piece, which is the American Jewish one, which is the fact that we are suffering from the worst anti-Semitism in this era than we have, well, certainly when we talk about Pittsburgh and Poway, it's never been this bad ever. And we have a legitimate concern and upset with an uptick in anti-Semitism and white nationalism. And just this morning, we found out the arrest of multiple members of a white supremacy gang looking to kidnap a governor of the state of Michigan. I mean, it is just horrendous to see what we have. So in Philip's question, I see, an affirmation of that narrative and that fear. So, and now I'll step out of my academics just to get, as I talk to my friends who are in activism, since I get the question a lot, I say, how should I answer the question? When we have sort of two different side-by-side parallel narratives, and they're occasionally going to come into conflict, sort of how do we deal with it? There's a third narrative. And the third narrative is about the decentering of communities of color, which is to say that part of the Black American experience, brown American experience, is the fact that that those communities are on the margins, and oftentimes white folks, and I think women face this from men a lot as well, will start speaking and start making demands, and all of a sudden the other group goes into a marginal or subservient role. And so the first challenge we have is the competing notions of history, but the second one is yet another time when Black folk are being told by white folk what they have to do and say in order to be accepted by white folk. And then if they don't do and say that, then the white folk are going to retreat from social justice activism. Or as friends of mine in the Black Jewish community have reflected to me, referring to what they're dealing with among white Jews, like if I had to have every white person agree with me on issues of race in order to work with them, I wouldn't have anyone to work with. So part of our challenge now is finding space, and now I'm not speaking as an academic, but it's just to find space for multiple sort of understandings And we'll go to Farrakhan, right? Because he is just a rabid anti-Semite. He is just horrible and needs to be condemned by everyone. And it turns out the fact that he's willing to speak truth to white power makes him a hero among many in the Black community who also understand that he's also a sexist and he's anti-LGBTQ and. So I just say now is a time to hold a lot of that complexity together.
So following up on that, we have a question from Dale Rosengarten, who has asked me to read it for her, specific to Charleston. In Charleston in recent years, there seems to be a rapprochement between Black and Jewish organizations. Do you see this hopeful trend in other places?
Yeah, thank you. So I do see it. And one was, you know, when the book came out before this racial reckoning, and then even more so now. So I was down in Alabama actually, and I was giving a talk in Birmingham, and it was to an audience of white Jews and Blacks. And then we, you know, I gave basically a longer version of the book talk, and then we had like a dinner party afterwards, and a local African-American businessman came up to me and said, you know, do you want to know the future of Black-Jewish relations and how we can make it better? I said, I'd love to know, you know, and he said, access to capital. He said, in the American Jewish social mobility, there's been access to capital and business and banks and all the corporations, and the Black community is still suffering, you know, from institutional racism around lending practices and giving. He says, what if Blacks and Jews get together in business? And Black communities as partners are going to know those communities for economic redevelopment. Whites can bring in the capital. We'll all make money together. We'll improve the community together. What do you think? You know, I said, that sounds great. And then this is where bad news is good news. With the rise of white supremacy in the current political environment. So first of all, I should say, part of the mythology of the 50s and 60s was white Jews and Blacks thinking they had more in common than they really did. Actually, they understood that they didn't. That was my point. But those of us watching from the outside didn't, you know, sort of blurred through those differences. It turns out that systemic anti-Semitism and systemic racism are coming from the same place, from white supremacy. It doesn't matter to a white supremacist if you're a white Jew or a Black. So here, and I was earlier in the day on another panel for Jewish Currents, so there was some labor activists who were on this panel, and I got to ask, you know, like, well, what do you think about what's going on today and how much better it is? And she was saying it's a whole lot easier to organize when two communities that used to be more separate see themselves as needing to be together for their individual interest and for their common interest. To put a hopeful spin in what could seem like a negative statement, and I got this from one of the TV personalities. If this isn't the best time ever to do this work, and if we as a nation can't achieve progress in it, it will take another 100 years before a similar window of opportunity opens, which means we are in an historic moment now. We're literally living the history day by day. And in this awareness that white America has, and the willingness to review their own conceptions of history and to take action, I am optimistic.
So I don't see any more questions in the chat right now. So I'd like to take us along to something that I know you want to talk about, and I'd like to hear you talk about. And that has to do with the two different sides of the coin. The question of the color of Jews, the ties of class and whiteness. I've heard you talk elsewhere about how once Jews became middle class, they became white, and ultimately that kind of put them in a different category when it comes to the civil rights movement and the kind of ethnic revival that happened afterwards. And then the other part of this is the issue of the fact that the Jewish community is more diverse today than ever before. And I think anywhere from 12 to 15% of Jews identify as of color. So how do we bring this part of the Jewish community into this story?
Thank you. So first I want to thank everyone for attending and for listening, because we're moving through a lot of very complicated, challenging, and sensitive topics very quickly. This is the Jews and whiteness. So first I'll say, like I'm calling myself a white Jew because, like, you know, I'm white presenting, but that said, whiteness is not just the color of your skin, although of course, if you don't have white skin, it matters because you can be identified. Jews who are white presenting have been considered non-white through a lot of history and a lot of places. In the United States, you know, Jews did not become white. That's the expression until after World War II and really through the 1950s. So as Jews were able to move from the margins of society where they were victimized sociologically as Jews through anti-Semitism, to come to a place where they were welcomed into the white middle class and into the suburbs, into becoming white, that of course changed the history and changed the relationships, especially around civil rights and racial justice. And what Eric Goldstein argues in his book, The Price of Whiteness, is that it wasn't until Jews became white that they were first able to reach across the racial divide. And so a whole lot sort of my understanding of American Jewish history divides. I'll give another example. The Irish, when they came to Boston in the mid-19th century, were actually called the Black Irish. They weren't black, they were white, but they were considered black. They were lower on the social order than free blacks in that time period. And by now, of course, Irish Americans are ethnic Americans to be sure, but they're certainly considered to be white. So that's a quick overview on Jews and whiteness. On Jews of color, I'll tell the story of the book's epilogue, and that is that I'd finished the book. I'll just say 20 years late because it took a long time to do this project. And I was so happy to have it done. And I knew it needed an epilogue because the book ends in 1980. But I just wanted like a month or so to not wake up in the morning and be upset with myself that I'm still working on the book, you know. And I sent it away to my editor. And I went and had lunch with Ilana Kaufman. And Ilana is now the founder and president of the Jews of Color Initiative. She's a Black Jewish woman. And we get together every once in a while and just chat. And at this lunch, it happened to be the 50th anniversary of the famous Selma March, where King and Heschel marched. And the NAACP and Judaism's reform movement had created a new march, this one to DC, where 200 Reform rabbis were going to march arm in arm with Black NAACP members. And then in DC, they were going to have a voting rights rally. All sounds well and good. Except as Ilana and I were talking about it, I'm like, well, I'm afraid all these white rabbis, and I'm in the Reform movement, so I'm critiquing my own denomination. All my rabbi friends are going to come back and give sermons that they were like Heschel. They prayed with their feet, which is not actually what Heschel said. And they're going to miss the point, right? They're going to be in that Y thinking rather than the X or the Z. And then Ilana said to me, so we talked about the Facebook pictures, right? Because all the rabbis put up a Facebook picture, and it was a white rabbi with the Torah and a Black NAACP member marching and smiling, right? With police escort. That was the difference. The second time around, the police escorted them. And she says, where am I in that picture? What if you're Black and Jewish? And then I thought about the phrase Black-Jewish relations. I use it all the time. I used it in the book. Black-Jewish relations only work if Jews are white. Because if you're Black and Jewish, I don't know, maybe you get Freudian about this. I don't know what kind of relationship that would be. And that phrase itself and the way in which that march was orchestrated erased the experience of Black Jews. And then she took it to me in a nice and respectful but direct way. She said, you wrote 200 pages on Blacks and Jews and not a single page on a Black Jew. Well, I immediately said, well, there weren't too many. You know, I just have my blah, 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 right? And then she said, well, look, go reread each of your chapters and ask yourself. And so my book was about how what you thought was really Jewish was really about being an American. What you thought was really Jewish was really about being in the 60s. What you thought was being Jewish was really about Black power, right? Those were the 3 points I was making. And she said, reread each chapter and ask yourself, what if what it was really about was Jews being white? How much of this story and the history is actually framed through racial privilege? And I feel comfortable sharing this because Ilana has shared this publicly many times. She described what it was like when she was a kid in the Soviet Jewry movement, which I write about in the book, you know? And like all the Jews are going to the Soviet embassy, the consulate in San Francisco to protest. And you've got to walk through the Black neighborhood of San Francisco to get there. And here's all these white Jewish kids walking blindly through a Black neighborhood, paying no attention to racism in America, standing in the to free Soviet Jews. And so Ilana, critique my treatment of the Soviet Jewry movement as one that is not sensitive to a racial lens. So what I did in the epilogue is I used that lunch conversation to sort of talk about the contemporary scene. And the best we can tell now is 12 to 15% of American Jews identify as Jews of color. Ari Kelman at Stanford, your alma mater, did the research, although he can't tell for sure because the demographic studies haven't asked the right questions or haven't done them in a longitudinal way so that we can see it over time. And I basically say, okay, the next historiographic school is going to view this through a racial lens. Probably a Jew of color needs to be the one to write that. Technically, a white Jew could. I just happen to think we're probably going to get a deeper and richer analysis otherwise.
Yeah, thank you. So I wanted to kind of pick your brain and push you a little further, because as I teach the history of African Americans and Jews, which in and of itself is a problematic title, but as I teach the history of Blacks, Jews, and Jews of color in the United States, I find myself often teaching in a way where I teach the history, parallel experiences, intersections of Blacks and Jews in different regions, moments where they consciously come together and work together, moments where they kind of break apart. And I find myself then at the end of class saying, well, now we've gotten to the section on the story of Jews of color. And so I'm wondering how, as you as an educator, think about integrating this more fully in teaching American Jewish history, or how those of us who are Jewish studies scholars in the class can begin to complicate kind of the prevailing idea that Jews are outwardly appearing white, and so this is their story.
Oh, so good, right? This is about assumptions and biases and what I'll call failure of consciousness. And, the bad news for me is I'm always learning. The good news is, yeah, shouldn't all of us be always learning? And that's actually a good thing, right? I'll speak personally because that's all that I can do, because I know that you're centering Jews of color in future conversations, and that's critical, for this work. For me, it's how language reflects underlying assumptions. And I will say something, whatever it will be, and then somebody will read it back to me and explain how my brain must have been operating to have possibly framed it in that way. And then offer alternate vocabulary, but it's not just a vocabulary, right? When I look at the new vocabulary, I'm completely reconstructing the way I'm organizing that thought. So that's sort of the theoretical part, right? I'll just share with you, when I was on the Jewish Currents broadcast 2 hours ago, it happened to me and someone sent me a private chat, right? I talked about, white Jews, when Jews became white, right? That was like, and we even talked about it. And this individual said, please add Ashkenazi before you say Jews became white. Ashkenazi Jews became white. I was like, well, I didn't really think about that. That's a lot of syllables to always have to say. But guess what? If you say Jews becoming white, I'm assuming white Ashkenazi Jews becoming white, because if there's a Jew of color listening and I say Jews become white, just by dropping that word Jews, I'm also implying the assumption that I'm only speaking to those who are already Ashkenazi or already white. So that's really, in these months especially, where I'm listening and learning.
Yeah, it really does feel like pulling back layers a lot of the time. I find each time I teach this class, I look back at my last syllabus and I was like, oh, like, what was I thinking? Why didn't I see it that way? And I'm sure when I look at the syllabus again, it will be peeling back another layer and getting a little deeper each time. We have a question from Yaron.
Thank you. So my question is related naturally to Black-Jewish relations, but not directly to what you've spoken about so far. I want to ask about this issue of some aspects of the Black community endorsing BDS. in recent years. Now, I know it's been more of a big deal a few years ago than it is now, but I guess my question is, if there is some desire to work together and strengthen the relationship between African Americans and Jews, or Blacks and Jews, was it, in your view, a strategic mistake on behalf of whoever wrote the official Black Lives Matter platform a few years ago to choose out of all of the social justice cases that one could identify with in the world, just one, the one of Palestinians? Was it a mistake for major authors in the social justice movement, such as Angela Davis, to write an entire book about social justice where she compares the Black struggle to that of Palestinians, but if you actually search the book, you won't find any mention of Syria, Iraq, Russia, China, or any other aggressors who are way more significant if we are looking at it from a social justice perspective. In other words, has that pivot to that direction harmed this relationship? And is there a way out of it, or maybe we are out of it already?
All right, so there's a lot there. Most of it is outside of not only my scholarly research, but my role as an historian. I'm gonna bring it to that in a moment, but first, I'll go back to the earlier question to say that there is anti-Israel and anti-Zionism among folks in the Black community, and there's also great support for Israel among other folks in the Black community. So I want to make sure that we are segmenting and not coming up with any group-based statement. Black Lives Matter is a slogan. It's not, and I guess we could call it a movement, although there's an interesting debate about what's called a movement. It's actually a whole lot of different organizations that all rally around that slogan. One of the organizations, called the Movement for Black Lives, came up with a 40,000 word platform. It's not the official platform of Black Lives Matter. It's the official platform of one of the groups that's allied with it, right? And there are about 200 words there, which were, as you describe, anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, and perhaps anti-Semitic. It was written by 3 particular individuals, right? So what we have, and I'm going to sort of give the meta story, is 3 anti-Zionists on the left who linked the struggle for Blacks in America with the struggle for Palestinians. And that's their narrative. And the moment they put that in there, it hit on a larger constructed narrative among American Jews on fear of anti-Israel, anti-Zionism, and anti-Semitism. And those 200 words grew huge in the American Jewish community, even though the point, as it were, was not that organization or its 40,000 words or its 200 words, right? The point was Black Lives Matter. So what we have now is sort of the meta question, and this I'll also refer back to a lesson I learned from Ilana Kaufman when she got this question, and she asked, what's the point, right? If the point is that Black Lives Matter, let's everyone support the fact that Black Lives Matter, and certainly, for Black Jews and Jews of color, it does matter, right? And when I called my activist friends to say, okay, how do you deal with those 200 words? They're like, guess what? If white Jews are going to say that because 3 people in the movement wrote 200 words in a 40,000 word program of their own political views that we disagree with, and therefore American Jews should either leave the movement or offer a challenge to Black people to disassociate from it, we're going to lose on every front. Right? We're not going to help racial justice, and we're not going to express well this sense of solidarity. So instead, they say we're going to support Black Lives Matter. We're going to get proximate to Blacks. And then while we're sitting side by side, at the demonstration, we'll say, hey, we need to talk about Jewish nationalism. Because guess what? For me as a Jew, I happen to believe that Zionism is central to my identity and it's important. And I'm not really pleased that I'm sensing more and more, and then you go from there. The part that is in my research was a split that occurred in the mid-60s around the state of Israel. Between 1948 and somewhere in the mid-60s, Israel was seen by the American left as a socialist utopia. The kibbutz movement, the moshav movement, the histadrut, the labor unions, healthcare for everybody, and the idea that a leftist could create a nation state on a socialist model and succeed was what they loved. And just for fun, if anyone's interested, there's a documentary that was nominated for an Academy Award called Berkeley in the 60s. It might have won, I'm not sure, it was at least nominated. And in the middle of a free speech movement protest in Sproul Hall, they somehow bring in a record player and play Israeli folk dance music, and the protesters jump to their feet and do Israeli folk dancing. And the protest is not about anything Jewish, right? That just happened. And to me, that's a reflection of where the left and Zionism and Jews and Israel coalesced in Berkeley. But it wouldn't happen today. You wouldn't have that happening, right? Because there was a flip which occurred where Palestinians were seen now as Black Americans. And the white Southern sheriffs with the water cannons now became the Israeli military and the Israeli police. And in this new rearrangement of the historical narrative, Jews, American Jews, went from being social justice activists to being Zionist colonial imperialists. And maybe I'll close this off because Ashley asked in the beginning about my current book, right? And I know Steve Whitfield was on a call with me a couple of weeks ago when we talked about it. When I was teaching at a community college in a politically conservative neighborhood, and I protested some anti-Semitism, I was called a self-hating leftist Jew. And it was a 3-year anti-Semitism fight. And it got so bad, I actually had to resign my tenure, and I came to SF State because of this terrible incident down in LA. And I drove the 400 miles from LA to San Francisco, and I'm unloading my books in my new office, and I'm now called a right-wing Zionist colonial conspirator. And I'm like, that was a long drive with the family, but I didn't change my political views in Kettleman City, which is the halfway point on I-5 between the two cities. So I think, so the book actually unwinds that 400-mile drive, and maybe it gets sort of deeply into your point that Jews are often perceived as the opposite of whatever it is, and Zionism has gone from being an idealistic left-wing ideology to the embodiment of oppression of people around the world, right? And so I think a lot of what's going on the college campuses today is nothing new in that sense, and it's still growing from that flip in the Black Power era.
Great. Well, it looks like we're out of time. I would love to thank Professor Dollinger and my co-hosts Yaron and Kim for sharing your time with us. This was really such an enlightening and important conversation to have. I'm sure it's just the first of many to come. And I know I'm walking away with a lot to think about. I'm sure I'm not the only one. And I just wanted to bring up the fact that we have 2 events next week. We have on Tuesday, as Yaron said, the event with Manish Tana in conversation with Professor Shanes. And then we have our Body and Soul event, which is first a film screening. And then afterwards, we will have a conversation on Thursday night with Professor Karen Chandler from the music department and the Grammy Award winning Charlton Singleton of Ranky Tanky. So thank you so much for giving us your time. It was really wonderful.
Thank you. Thrilled to be here. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Thank you. This was great.